Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get going, and as more people come on, it'll be great. Welcome to event number 1 of the webinar, our Prairie Watershed Climate Program webinar speaker series. Today's topic is focused on nitrogen management, and we have a great speaker today, and really looking forward to it. My name is Dan Cox, and I'm the project manager for the Manitoba Association of Watersheds. And I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. Today's event is you are able to collect nitrogen management CEUs for those of you that are CCAs. So if you want to scan the QR code on the screen right now, please do so right now. I'll have it up on the screen at the end as well, and you will be able to get 1 nitrogen management CEU for attending today's event. If you need to do the manual, if you don't have the app available and you need to manually sign up, please email me after the event, and we'll make sure that you're signed up for your credit. So a couple of reminders for today's presentation. It is being recorded and it will be posted to the Manitoba Association of Watersheds YouTube page and promoted on our social media. Feel free to share and promote as well across your social media platforms. The Q&A function is available in this webinar. So if you have questions during the presentation today, please use the Q&A function in Zoom, and there will be time at the end of the presentation for questions and answers. And any unanswered questions that we have at the conclusion of today's event will be followed up by Ma and our speaker following today's event. So I think many of you on the line are all aware of the Prairie Watershed Climate Program, but the 3 BMPs that are the main focus of Prairie Watershed Climate Program are rotational grazing, nitrogen management, and cover cropping. And the PWCP webinar speaker series over the next number of months is intended to touch on all of those topics, starting with today's topic on nitrogen management with our speaker. And so I will gladly introduce our speaker, Denis Tremorin, who is the Director of Sustainability at Pulse Canada and is a professional agrologist with 14 years of experience. Denis received his bachelor's and master's degrees in agroecology and soil science from the University of Manitoba. Denis's role at Pulse Canada is to develop and implement a sustainability strategy to develop tactics for each of Pulse Canada's work areas. Denis explores the role that pulses can play in improving the environmental sustainability of food and agricultural systems. And Denis also serves as chair of Field to Market Canada, an organization focused on developing metrics and tools that enable measurement of environmental performance of Canadian crops. So welcome, Denis, to the webinar today, and we really appreciate your time, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
All right, Dan, thanks for that. I'm going to share my screen, and we'll see how this works, and then I can introduce myself a little bit more. Can you see that, Dan?
Yeah, just coming up now. Yep, there it is.
Yeah, perfect. There we go. So yeah, thanks a lot, Dan. My name's Denis. I'm a resident of Winnipeg. That's where Pulse Canada is situated. I've been working for Pulse Canada for 13 years now, always in the area of environmental sustainability. And in my past role, I used to work for High Life as the operations manager on the environment file as well. So I've had some roles that are more technical currently, but in the past I was doing more operations, in-field management type activities, especially related to manure management. But this, I'll just preface this presentation today by saying I'm not an agronomist. and I don't deal with field studies and field work as much as I did in the past. Really, there's a delegation of workload nationally in Canada when it comes to pulses, and the provincial associations really focus on the R&D and the agronomy management and support for producers individually. So in the Manitoba's case, it's the Manitoba Pulse and Soybean Growers who are the relevant organization when it comes to questions around, pulses and adoption and how to grow them and kind of, the specifics of that. But I'll give a bit of a presentation on what's the role of pulses in nitrogen management and the potential of pulses in reducing the need for nitrogen in crop rotations when we introduce them, and kind of the subsequent environmental benefits of pulses and rotations, and how we can leverage that to gain an advantage for pulses and markets, and also for individual producers as well. So I'm going to get going just to provide a bit of an overview of Pulse Canada. We're a value chain association that's national in scope, and we represent growers, traders, and processors of Canadian pulses. And the pulses that we focus on are really peas and lentils primarily. Those are the two largest crops that we grow in Canada. We also represent dry bean production and chickpea and faba bean production as kind of an emerging crop. We have 4 provincial members that represent farmers. We represent about 25,000 farmers across these 4 organizations in Manitoba, Ontario, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. The Canadian Pulse and Special Crop Trade Association is another one of our members, and that's an association that represents trade and processors. New companies like Roquette are members of this association. We also have the large bulk trading companies like Cargill and Viterra and Richardson that are members of that. But then we also have a lot of kind of traditional special crop processors that have been doing this business for a long time, that are shipping lentils in containers or in 100-pound bags around the world. And what we do is those member associations take their checkoff dollars in the case of growers, and their membership dues with industry, and they decide how much money they want to provide to our national association at Pulse Canada for programming that we basically leverage those industry dollars with the government of Canada. So we typically try to maximize any contribution we get by using program money for programs like agri-marketing program or the agri-assurance program at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. The story of pulses in Canada is a long one. The pulses have been growing, especially in Western Canada, for decades. It precedes this 1980s number, but the production really started to take off in the 90s and the 2000s, as especially in the western part of the prairies, we saw a real diversification of the crop production system. We saw moving away from summer fallow, and that production system shifted towards something that was more sustainable and more resilient due to that semi-arid climate that exists, especially on the western prairies. And dry peas and lentils were really the core of that system in terms of pulses. So we saw, we've seen a decrease in cereal production, in cereal acres. We saw an increase in canola, but we've also seen a large increase in pulse production on the prairies. That started to level off, but we have about, kind of a stable 7 million ton production system across the prairies, with beans and chickpeas and now faba beans kind of making up the minority of the production, but still significant at the same time. So Canada we're a top producer and exporter of pulses globally. We're the second largest producer of pulses in the world after India. And we're the largest exporter in the world. So typically India is producing a very large crop, but they are consuming all of it internally. There's very little trade outside of India. But Canada is the opposite. We produce a large crop, but the vast majority of it is exported, and little is used internally, except for feed and for seed purposes. But we were starting to see a shift in that, with more interest in ingredient processing in Canada. So there's more domestic demand in North America. This is just the Canadian scenario, where we're seeing investments in pulse processing for flour production, for proteins. And that's helping drive some domestic demand that didn't exist before. And we foresee that to continue, especially with some plants now starting to focus on different pulse crops like faba bean for processing. I think, that the idea of pulses really kind of a few years ago, this is already 7 years ago now, but it kind of hit a high mark in terms of global recognition in 2016, where the UN recognized pulses through the International Year System. And it was a really good opportunity to kind of raise awareness of the benefits of pulses in terms of nutrition globally, but also for their environmental benefits that align well with the Sustainable Development Goals that existed at the time. And I think, this is something that we work on continuously, is trying to raise awareness of pulses in their role from a global nutrition. We feel like at the end of the day, these crops are underutilized, and they're also underproduced in a lot of parts of the world, including in Canada, where there's still room to grow production in a lot of areas that don't have pulses in rotation. I'll preface one more thing. I think when we talk about pulses from a national perspective, we don't include soy. So some of our provincial counterparts represent soy, like Manitoba pulse and soybean growers, as well as Saskatchewan and Alberta pulse growers. But from a national association perspective, we don't cover pulses with our programming that we have here at Pulse Canada. Just get some clarification across the board here. Another thing I want to just bring up is this context that there's a lot of discussion in the food industry and in agricultural circles these days about what regenerative agriculture. And I just want to kind of lay the groundwork here around the premise that I think what we have in Western Canada is specifically is a system that actually is pretty well aligned with the principles of regenerative agriculture. And I think both sides, we see kind of a disconnect around this conversation in some cases, where I think we as agriculturalists and agricultural experts and farmers in the west of Canada, we see this term and we ask ourselves, what else can we do? What else do you want us to do? We've already done a lot. And I think food industry also comes at this question with an assumption that our systems are weak, or they have soil health challenges, or they're very degraded and they need regenerating. And I think we have to be careful how we approach this, because in a large part, a lot of our systems in Western Canada are in good shape in terms of soil health. And we've adopted a lot of these principles in Western Canada, especially where a lot of pulses are being grown. So these concepts of reduced tillage, keeping the soil covered, and maximizing crop diversity. I mean, I don't know if you can do better than a lot of the farmers that we have in parts of the prairies around those concepts. And in some cases, adding things like living roots to a system, or integrating livestock into a cropping system, that those are local challenges sometimes that don't make sense for specific producers. So I think that's where we see a bit of a disconnect here, but I think at the end of the day, we have a lot to leverage already. And I think we as an industry can tell our story better in terms of, well, this is what we're already doing. And there are limitations to what we can add to the system because of the context of that system from a climate perspective and from an ecological perspective. So I think this is we have to prepare ourselves for these conversations in a sense, and also inform industry that we've already moved ourselves up the curve quite a bit in this conversation. There's still some room to try to play around with the system to make improvements, but we're not where we were in the 1960s and 1970s with lots of cultivation, lots of soil erosion, and degraded soils. So this conversation has changed, and we should adapt with that. And I think what I want to give here was that peas, pulses really are part of that system that we have in Western Canada. They really help diversify that rotation, and the reason why they've been adopted, especially when it comes to peas and lentils and chickpeas, is that a large part of the prairies are semi-arid. Right now we're in the middle of a drought, I would say, in the Red River Valley here, and that's the case across the prairies, where we're prone to having drought conditions, and pulses pulses like peas and lentils really help with the resilience of that system in a semi-arid way. And that's because they use water in a different way than other crops, especially wheat and canola. They use water during a shorter period of the growing season. They use the water in a shorter part of the soil profile, and they leave more water for the next crop. And that's probably the most important piece, is that they're allowing the next crop to still have some moisture and not drawing down those reserves as much as some of these other crops. So you have to look at this from a holistic perspective and a cropping system perspective when we're talking about the advantages of pulses. Sometimes it's not so evident when you just look at them on their own. And then we also, though, there's a lot of evidence around the involvement of pulses when it comes to soil health. There's been some good research in Western Canada on the role of pulses and improving soil microbial diversity and populations, and how that affects nitrogen and fertilizer and nutrient dynamics and cycling in soils. And this is one of the reasons why we see yield increases after pulses. Some of it is a nitrogen benefit, but a lot of it has to do with availability of nutrients, but also availability of water, which I just mentioned. So all of these components kind of come together. We have nitrogen fixation, we've got soil microbial diversity, we've got some soil moisture benefits. All of these things can come together to help improve the productivity of the system, while also maintaining kind of a lower amount of inputs than you would see if you didn't have pulses in that system. But really, one of the cruxes here of my discussion today is the concept of nitrogen fixation and its role in reducing the amount of nitrogen required in a cropping system, and the implications of that for greenhouse gas emissions and other environmental outcomes. So we look at pulses in Western Canada. This was a paper by Fran Wally that looks at the nitrogen fixation capacity of different crops. Fran Wally is a professor at the University of Saskatchewan, where a ton of this work has been done, especially on pulses. And you'll see that there's variability between crops, with faba bean being almost like alfalfa as being a really high nitrogen fixer. It can fix almost all of its needs. Peas and lentils are kind of in the middle, as well as chickpea. And then bean is lower on the list there. Dry bean is not a very effective nitrogen fixer compared to these other crops, and that's why we actually fertilize dry beans today. So not all pulses are kind of created equal in that sense, but really at the end of the day, chickpea, lentil, pea, and faba bean are all crops that, if inoculated, don't require any nitrogen fertilizer. They can fix all the nitrogen they need to produce a big crop if the conditions are good. But dry bean is the one crop that, yeah, we do fertilize with smaller amounts of fertilizer, maybe 40 to 60 pounds. And there's actually some good research here at the University of Manitoba with Kristen McWilliam, showing that there's potential to actually use inoculants if they're selected. There's some more work to do, but if we select the right inoculant, there's potential to actually grow dry bean without the use of nitrogen fertilizer as well. And I think the other story here is farmers in Western Canada use these nitrogen fixing bacteria. Farmers have a really well adopted practice in terms of using inoculant. And this is not always the case internationally. We've heard of some cases in Europe where farmers actually fertilize their their pulse crops like peas for some reason. Maybe because the inoculants don't work well in their cropping system, or for whatever reason. It could be wet soils. But in our cases, we're using these. The adoption rate is high, and then therefore the fertilizer rates, especially for nitrogen, on those pulse crops are very low. If anything, they're just tied to the monoammonium phosphate or maybe ammonium sulfate that's applied to the crop that's being grown. And I think this really ties to the carbon footprint of these crops. Pulses are known now known to have some of the lowest carbon footprints of any crop in the world, and that's due to their nitrogen fixing capacity. So if we look at this study here, which was by Yantai-Gan with AAFC, you'll see that the pulse crops that we grow in rotation, whether it be different soil conditions like the brown or black soils, they always have a lower carbon footprint than spring wheat or canola that require nitrogen fertilizer. And the reason for that, I'll go to my next slide, is that if we look at wheat and canola, the vast majority of the greenhouse gas emissions that come from wheat and canola come from the production and the application of synthetic fertilizer. And so growing a pulse in rotation really eliminates that potential production of greenhouse gas in the year that we grow the pulse, but also even in the following year. So what we see is the majority of emissions for pulses actually comes from the crop residues when they're decomposed, whereas other crops that require fertilizer, the majority comes from the fertilizer itself. And so pause for some water. And you can see this, we did some life cycle assessment studies with producer data through survey. And this is from Pulse Canada itself. We worked with the University of British Columbia to collect data. And you'll see that even the pulse world, you'll see that with navy beans being different than pea production, navy beans needing a little bit of that nitrogen, that really drives the total emissions up per ton of navy beans to over 300 compared to peas, which is under 75. And really the driver of that is the fertilizer. So fertilizer is the biggest contributor there when it comes to that system. And when we look at the potential, especially in Western Canada, in the Western prairies where we have no-till adoption rates that are really high, we see that there's actual potential for pulse production to be carbon neutral or even carbon negative, because the amount of carbon sequestration we have from that cropping system is bigger than the amount of emissions that come from the production of that. So this all depends on how these things are modeled. This was a study that was done by the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Crops, and this report's actually been was representing lentils, but the same would be, you could say the same for peas as well in Western Canada. And so this is a good news story, I think, for pulses, and they really have a contribution to that rotation. And that's what I'm going to kind of go to next in the next few slides. The other thing I was going to say is that basically the emissions of pulses are actually probably lower than we estimate them to be, and that's because this crop residue contribution I was speaking about just a few minutes ago is actually lower than the estimates that were produced in the past. So right now, Canada is actually actively changing their modeling that they use for the International Panel for Climate Change. And that's because we've had new research that shows that crop residues are actually emitting way less nitrous oxide, which is that major greenhouse gas, than we thought it was going to produce in the estimates that existed before. So those coefficients that we used for crop residues for greenhouse gas emissions are going to be much lower. This is based on research at the University of Saskatchewan and Manitoba, and also some work at Guelph. And what was found was really, at the end of the day, nitrogen content of those crop residues is not the only factor. It's also that there's other factors in play when it comes to the quality of that residue and why it produces more or less emissions. And so that was reflected in this study with pulse residues versus other cereal and oilseed residues. But really, at the end of the day, what this really tells us is, we're not producing as much emissions as we thought with pulse production, and even in all crops, because crop residues were assumed to be producing more than we thought they were. I can explain that a bit more. My master's degree kind of involved this type of nitrogen dynamics work, and I have a pretty good understanding of that. So what we also know, there's been a lot of research for decades now through the long-term research plots that existed at Indian Head and Scott's and Swift Current. We've known for a long time that pulses provide a good benefit to the cropping system, and they benefit the following crop. And so there's been some more recent studies on this as well, looking at the rotational effects of legumes on crops like canola and malting barley in terms of yield. And they've even found evidence that there's yield benefits, not just the year after a pulse crop, but there's also yield benefits 2 years after a pulse crop as well. This is particularly good for wheat, where you see, especially for hard red spring, you see not only a yield increase, but you also see a boost in protein content, which can drive a premium. And this benefit that we saw with yield can translate into the carbon footprint of cereals actually being lowered when they're grown in rotation with pulses. And so this was some research that was done, I think, again, by Yantai Gan, that looked at pulses in rotation, and we found that there was you could show that durum wheat in production and rotation had a smaller greenhouse gas or carbon footprint than if it was grown without the pulse in rotation itself. And we've done some work as well at Pulse Canada on this. We worked with the Saskatchewan Research Council. We actually were able to develop what is called a meta-analysis worth of evidence on this benefit, because there's been so many studies in Canada. You can actually compile them up and conduct a meta-analysis, which is kind of like you're basically accumulating all the results of all the research, and you're trying to see if all of them are statistically significant if you bring them together. And we found that yes, there's a strong nitrogen benefit for pulses, and that actually can be translated into a greenhouse gas benefit for the crop and for the rotation itself. And we followed this up with some extra work as well. We've looked at each individual province. Recently, we did a carbon study and an economic study on pulses nationally in Canada. And this report showed that in each province, if pulses are grown in rotation, and we looked at faba beans, we looked at dry beans, we looked at peas and lentils, depending on the province. We found that whenever a pulse is included in that rotation, you see a benefit compared to the standard rotation, as long as it wasn't replacing something like soybean. And that's just because you're replacing a crop in the rotation and you're supplanting it with a crop that requires less nitrogen. And this is even true in the case of dry beans. Dry beans, they need some nitrogen, but they need a lot less than you would need for another crop in rotation. So there's advantages kind of across the board when we include pulses in rotation when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. And we actually, through that report I just mentioned, we actually nationalized that benefit. So if we actually talk about the impact of crop production across Canada, the amount of tons it produces in terms of greenhouse gas emissions is about 25 million or 26 million tons of CO2 equivalent. And what we found was that when the national impact of pulses across the country is we're abating emissions by about 2.8 to 3.6 million tons, depending on how you do the analysis. So we're basically because we're growing pulses, we have about 3.6 million tons of carbon that's not being released into the air. And I can't remember, there was a number, I think that's about 1.1 million cars that's off the road. I'd have to double check that. I had another slide that showed that. We also looked at growth potential. And we looked at, well, where we've got this really good story already, but is there potential to grow the pulse industry as well, especially if we look at the prairies? And what we found is there's a really strong concentration of pulses especially in West Central and Southwestern Saskatchewan, and also in kind of this band of southeastern Alberta. But there's also potential for growth, especially in the kind of wetter parkland region of the prairies, including in Manitoba and the Northern Strip. And when we know that area is typically, especially in Saskatchewan and Alberta, is typically very canola centric. It's canola and cereals, and there's potential to grow pulses in that region if they can be competitive in the production system. And so we did do some growth estimates to see, well, what would happen if we continued our growth trajectory, or if it went a little bit lower, or if it went higher. And what we found was, if we have a high rate of growth, or even a low rate of growth, or if we had a high rate of growth, we would that production system could add 1.7 million more pulse acres on the prairies, and that would reduce emissions by another 1.1 million tons of CO2. So I think really what we're trying to do here is incentivize, is show that pulses really have a role to play in reducing fertilizer requirements in cropping systems, and they really, because of that, they really reduce the emissions that we have. So we really focus heavily at Pulse Canada on highlighting that with our federal government, but also with our markets that have an interest in utilizing pulses or reducing emissions in their supply chains. There's a real benefit to utilizing pulses for that purpose. And there's a real opportunity to kind of maximize that opportunity when we can. And so really, we're really a market focused kind of organization, and that's a big, heavy focus of ours. This story could also be told around soybeans as well. There's a target of growing 6 million more acres of soybeans from Soy Canada in Western Canada, and that would help reduce emissions as well by a large amount of greenhouse gas emissions. That would be 1.2 million acres was the estimate that was produced by Soy Canada. And I guess the question after this is, well, how do we grow pulse production in Canada? It's not as simple as just saying, well, even if we had increased markets, there's an agronomic and a research component here that really needs to be fixed. And we've been really trying to attract the investment that's needed, from a public perspective, but also from a private perspective in these crops, because they're, investing in these crops really means you're investing in what I was just speaking about for half this presentation, which is, nitrogen reduction in cropping systems and greenhouse gas emission reductions that everyone's kind of asking for these days. And really, I think there's a couple things that really are a sharp focus for our producer organizations today when they're looking at R&D and investments. And even from a private perspective, it's the same thing. We need good yielding varieties that can compete with canola and cereals and rotations. And in order to maintain yield, we need good disease resistance. So, and that really, there's been really good research programs on leaf disease, and we've tackled that issue, for the large part. But really, root disease is the issue when it comes to things like peas and lentils. They really don't like wet feet, and we need to figure out how we can get genetics and germplasm with stronger root systems that can really hold back these issues with root disease. That's going to be a really key component to the research programs going forward. So new variety development is going to focus on that. The other big focus of ours is in our grower associations. We see a lot of potential for faba bean. Faba bean likes a wetter climate than peas and lentils. They don't have the same root disease issues that we see. But because the wetter regions of the prairies tend to be further north, especially in Saskatchewan and Alberta, those areas are prone to early frost. And what's needed there is kind of, faba bean varieties that have good high yielding, that are good and high yielding, have good, that maintain their yields, but also have a shorter season. That's not so much a problem in parts of Manitoba. one of the northern fringes it is. And the reason why we feel like there's a lot of potential for pulse for faba bean is because it's really at a position where peas were maybe 15 to 20 years ago. It's a crop in infancy, but there's a lot of things that would be pulling from a market perspective with faba bean. It's a high protein pulse crop. There's a lot of interest where it can be grown from farmers to grow another crop because they're really reliant on canola and cereals. It's suited well for the fractionation industry because it's high protein, and there's also a lot of potential for use in animal feed, whether as a fraction or as a whole crop. So we see a lot of potential there. We think that's kind of an up and coming crop that still is in the game, and we hope it's going to be it's going to really kind of jump on the piggyback of peas in terms of the demand that we see with peas today. And this, I think what we're trying to also say is this, increasing pulse production, or at least maintaining it, really complements this focus that we have on nitrogen use efficiency. We've heard the federal government kind of announce targets around fertilizer emission reductions. Well, one of the components that we need to focus on here is not just on 4R practices. There's a 5th R, we like to say in the pulse world, and that has to do with rotations. And a major part of rotations for fertilizer management is going to be pulses. And now I'm gonna shift a little bit here, because I think this idea of greenhouse gas reductions and fertilizer management is starting to really link solidly with what we're seeing companies move to, including in the food space. So food and agricultural companies are starting to really move towards this concept of net zero and greenhouse gas emission targets. But the way they're doing it now is shifting very quickly to a standard approach around measurement and target setting, which is really, it's really kind of boiling down to this one group, which is called the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And what I'm going to tell you is this is starting a conversation that provides a lot more definition of what the food industry is going to be asking their agricultural supply chains for when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. So it might not be that it has to come from an individual farmer, but there's going to be information that needs to start to flow so that companies can actually account for the greenhouse gas emissions in their supply chains. And then on top of that, where can they find opportunities to decrease greenhouse gas emissions from their supply chains, is going to be a really hot topic over the next few years here. And really, when it comes to agricultural systems, when food companies and agricultural companies are going to be coming into this space, and as we're seeing it right now, there's 3 types of scopes of emissions that they have to account for. Scope 1 is the emissions that come from their own facilities and their company vehicles. So you could just think about it, it's the diesel that goes in the trucks, and it's the natural gas that they use to heat their company facilities. Scope 2 is basically everything that they buy for electricity that's from off-site, and the emissions are linked to the production of that electricity or maybe other energy sources. But really, a lot of the focus for food industry is going to get to scope 3, which is upstream. Basically, if you're a food company, most of your emissions are tied to your farm production systems that are upstream. And so they have to get an idea of what does that look like? What are they buying? What's the footprint of those ingredients? And this is why we focused kind of heavily on this idea of, well, can we build data sets nationally at Pulse Canada for these pulse crops, and how do we make sure that those data sets and those life cycle assessments are kind of plugged in to the interest that we're starting to see coming from these companies. But I think it also provides opportunities, because historically what we've seen is the focus around carbon and agriculture has been on this idea of carbon offsets and selling carbon offsets into a credit system, or developing credits and selling them into an offset system. And really what's happened since is that the agriculture credits really haven't been part of the big story when it comes to offsets. Offsets are being produced and sold by the forestry sector and the land use sector and by the renewable energy sector. So you'll see companies like Bullfrog Power that make electricity, they sell a lot of credits. And when you look at a company that's, today has called themselves carbon neutral, this is really what they're buying into. They're not buying offsets from agriculture for whatever reason. They're buying them from forestry and land use and renewable agriculture and renewable energy. But this whole idea of net zero with this this science-based targets initiative changes the whole conversation, especially for food companies, where they actually have to embed those carbon reductions into their own supply chains. So they actually have to go back to agriculture and find ways to reduce emissions. And that means that value stays in the supply chain. It's not, you can't go outside anymore. So I think there's a lot of opportunities, and that's where this concept is moving away from carbon offsets to something called carbon insets. And I'm going to skip over this slide. Just going to check the time. So really the idea here is carbon insets is a payment that would go to a producer or somebody else in the supply chain that is showing that they're doing something that's reducing emissions. It would be a direct payment. You're not selling a credit into an offset system. It's not like a separate marketplace. You're basically paid directly because you're conducting a practice and you're collecting the paperwork around that practice. And some of the advantages of all that is that it's a bit of a simpler process, and the bars for verification are less because it's within the supply chain already. It's not an outside system. So it really encourages partnerships and collaboration. And the emphasis is on action within that corporate value chain and not outside of it. But I think I will preface this by saying this is all new stuff. Carbon insetting is a really new discussion. And because of that, the conversation is pretty conservative at this point in time. And I think there has to be a lot of maturation on how this is going to evolve going forward. But there is some work happening. There's some work in Canada, actually. And this is an example of one where there's input suppliers and buyers and retailers that are working together to pay farmers for a 4R reduction practice, for example. So if there's a 4R protocol that's applied to a farm, and all the data and all the paperwork is collected, they can demonstrate that this practice has been adopted. And the input supplier and the buyer and the retailer are both kind of putting money into the pot to say, okay, we want to incentivize this by giving some money to the producers that are adopting this, and then they can actually account for those greenhouse gas emission reductions. So really, what's happening is it's creating value out of something that was happening anyways, or at the end of the day, some of these practices are being applied today, but there's no value that's being created, or there's very little value that's being created. And I think that's the idea here, is just how do we create value around this for the farmer? And I think that also means, how do we create value for the entire supply chain so that they can actually account for those greenhouse gas emissions based on the fact that they're making these type of commitments around greenhouse gas reductions and net zero. So I think that's what I'm trying to, that's where it kind of wraps back to, is the idea that we have companies that are really defining net zero and specific targets, and that there's a lot of definition happening in terms of, well, how can that system actually account for that? And when that is accounted for, there's actually real potential for value, which didn't exist, I think, before as much. And I think, this is something that we're working on at Pulse Canada. That's how I'm going to kind of finish this off, is we're looking at this really hard in terms of, well, how could you develop a protocol for pulses and rotation? We know there's a large carbon benefit for pulses and rotation. We know that there's all of these specific targets that are out there, and there's money that's willing to be put into place. And we're looking at this specific thing. It's like, well, how can we develop a protocol and implement one? And we're at the early stages of that, I would say. We're exploring this. We're working with some consultants. We're also kind of in the marketplace asking people about what's out there. And the one thing I'd also add is we've been looking at this from a market perspective, and one of the markets that we have been in for a long time is feed. So peas and fava beans are well-known ingredients in Western Canada especially for pork production. They've been utilized heavily in Alberta and Saskatchewan and even Manitoba. And there's real potential to decrease emissions in pork production when we include peas in feed. So this was a study that we did with a group in Quebec that focuses on LCA. And we looked at rations and from a Western Canadian perspective and what happens when we include peas in that ration compared to a standard ration. And at the carcass level, within the focus of an LCA, we saw an 18% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Now, a lot of pork companies are like Maple Leaf and Tyson Foods and Springfield all have targets and all have discussions around sustainability. And now it's like, is there potential to really leverage this benefit, given that's the context that we're sitting in today? So that's that kind of all links together. We have these pulses. They fix nitrogen. We grow a lot of them in Canada. Manitoba has potential as well within the cropping systems that we have, and there's a lot of demand for carbon reductions in supply chains. So there's an agronomic perspective of this, but there's also a real market perspective that's starting to develop as well. So that was all I had today. I think didn't want to take too much time in case there were some questions. So I hope everybody enjoyed the presentation, and I'll be happy to have a discussion, Dan, now with some of the questions that are on the table. I see a couple that might have popped up.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you very much, Dennis, for that great presentation. There's no doubt that pulses are incredibly beneficial when it comes to carbon sequestration and overall greenhouse gas emissions. So thank you for that. And it's an incredibly relevant topic to the Prairie Watershed Climate Program, and increasing legumes in rotation is a very popular BMP as part of that program. And it's so some great insight today and some great feedback and some great statistics as well. So really appreciate that. Yeah, a couple questions in the Q&A. One was, will the presentation be made available to all participants? If you're okay with that, Dennis, I'd gladly share your presentation to the attendees today.
Yep, no problem. That sounds good.
Okay. One question here. It is my understanding that conventional ag, which uses herbicides and pesticides, has a negative influence on the soil biota. The data provided, I'm assuming, is from conventional ag and not organic that uses regenerative practices. How does the data change with a change in conventional versus organic?
I'm not that familiar with research on organic systems when it comes to that specific indicator. I know it's limited, to be honest. I mean, my understanding, I'm a soil scientist. I got a master's in soil science, and the potential for pesticides to impact soil biota is limited, because as long, at the end of the day, the soil is a pretty resilient system as long as you have a fairly healthy soil. And you don't have, we're not talking about systems where in Western Canada, we're not talking about systems that are really heavily reliant on pesticides. Like, it's not a horticultural system in California, for example, where it's you need to really there's a lot more pest pressures than we would have here. So the evidence that I know shows that there's limited impacts, but I don't have a lot of evidence on that either.
Appreciate that. Appreciate the feedback. I'm not seeing any other questions in the Q&A. Please, anybody has any questions, please type them in now. Again, really appreciate your time today, Dennis, on talking about pulses and nitrogen fixing and nitrogen management. As nitrogen management is a key part of the Prairie Watershed Climate Program going into the second year and hopefully years beyond. And so really appreciate that. Not seeing any other questions. So if it's okay with you, Dennis, we'll call it there. And like I said, the recording will be made available. I'm going to share my screen real quick just to put the code back up for people to access their credit. If they for nitrogen management on their CEUs. Back up. There. Again, if anyone has needs to do that on a manual basis, they feel free to email me at dan@manitobawatersheds.org after, and we can get that manually set up for you and get your credits. So again, I really appreciate your time today, Dennis, and look forward to everyone should look out for more information on our next topic in the webinar series, which will be cover cropping in August. So we'll look out for that information in regards to dates, and then the last one will be on rotational grazing later this year. So really appreciate it. Anything you want to close with Dennis?
No, I think, for the Manitobans in the audience, like when it comes to a lot of the agronomic questions, we've got a really strong producer organization here in Manitoba with the Manitoba Pulse and soybean growers. So I'd just like to give them a shout out. If you've got questions about pulse agronomy and practices, they are an excellent resource. They have technicians in place in Eastern and Western Canada that can help a farmer. You can have a face-to-face, you can have a phone call. They're there to answer all of your technical questions around production. So that's what I would kind of end off with, Dan. So,
right. Thank you very much for your time today, Dennis. Thank you everyone for attending today. Oh, some of those pop up. Maybe we do got a question. Oh, this says very good presentation. Thank you. Perfect. That's a good way to end. Nice compliments. Nice compliments. So thank you everyone. Like I said, the recording will be made available on our YouTube page and promoted on our social media. And we will send the presentation around to the attendees today and those who registered. So thank you again, everyone. Thank you, Dennis. And we will see you at the next webinar speaker series.
Okay, thanks, Dan.
Thank you.
Have a good day.